Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you all joined for another afikra conversation. Tonight, I'm joined by Antonia Carver, the director of Art Jameel. Thank you so much for joining. Antonia is the director of Art Jameel, which supports artists and creative communities across the Middle East. Art Jameel is a complementary, independent organization that fosters and promotes contemporary art and cultural heritage protection and creative entrepreneurship across the Middle East, North Africa, Turkey, and beyond. Antonia holds a Master of Arts from the University of Edinburgh in social anthropology. Before she began her career in publishing and arts journalism, she worked as an editor at Bidoun, one of my favorite magazines in the region. Prior to joining Art Jameel, Antonia was the director of Art Dubai. She has been involved with countless organizations across the Arab world, and I'm unbelievably excited to have her join our program. Antonia, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's really a wonder. It's a privilege to have you on the show because I feel like you are a type of person who has done a lot of different things. So I think what's interesting in your career is that you didn't start studying art history. You weren't studying the arts in university. How did you find yourself in the arts in the Middle East? Walk us through that story to just get us started.
Oh, thank you, and thanks to everybody for joining. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. I kind of ended up in the Middle East a little bit by accident. I'd been living partly in Australia and then partly in London, and I was working with film festivals, and I started in London connecting with the Arab and Iranian community in London, which, is obviously, London's a bit of a kind of Arab city. I think Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, not that we should really quote Boris Johnson, but anyway, he came up with this kind of quote that London is the 8th emirate. And I kind of, even in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, that's becoming very obvious. I was working in the late 90s for an organization in London called INNOVA, the Institute of International Visual Arts. And it was an organization that was really kind of something of a think tank. We kind of intervened in different museums and organizations and really trying to kind of campaign for a sense of internationalism in the arts and a recognition that cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool were becoming cities where to talk about kind of ethnic minorities was something of a misnomer, and there were already British cities at that time that were majority minority ethnic. So it's kind of a recognition of that and trying to sort of reflect that in the arts and use the arts as a prism to kind of understand the changing demographics of society. So through that, I started working with a number of Arab and Iranian artists and filmmakers, and kind of London was becoming very expensive and a little bit kind of constricted, and we thought, why not move somewhere? My husband's also an Arabic speaker and a journalist, and he also wanted to move somewhere in the region. He went ahead of me, landed in Dubai, because that's at the point where Media City was starting up, and most of the big media enterprises were moving to Dubai at that time. And I always remember him calling me. I was finishing a book in London. He called me and said, I wanted to come to the Arab world, and I don't think I really have, And so, because he'd lived a long time in places like Egypt and Palestine. But then very quickly, we got into being in Dubai, and very typically for people who were moving in those early 2000s, we moved there in 2001, thought we'll stay for a couple of years and then moved on to somewhere else, Beirut or Tehran or somewhere. And then, very quickly we kind of put down roots, and, 20 years later, still here and really, loving being here. When I arrived, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I was still working in publishing and in journalism, and was writing for the art newspaper about the arts and Screen International about the film world. And I was, for both of those, just by pure chance, happened to be their first Arab world correspondent at that time. Obviously, things have changed so radically since then in terms of an international awakening as to what's happening here. Bidoun happened very quickly after that. In 2003, we set up Bidoun along with Lisa Farjam, Negar Azimi, and Sunny Rahba, who now runs the Third Line Gallery in London, in Dubai, was part of that. And at that time, it was kind of, I guess, a recognition that the word Bidoun always has a certain sort of negativity around it. But what about, the international Arab and Iranian community? What about Middle Easterners that are living in one place, having been born in another, grown up in another, have family from somewhere else, isn't there also a kind of positivity in that? So we were kind of trying to sort of reinvent that. And I worked in Dubai, and my colleagues were in New York and Cairo and all over. And then in 2004, the Dubai Film Festival started, and because I've been involved in film festivals before, I kind of was lucky enough to jump in that as part of the kind of founding group of people that were very much part of that, and again working on the Arab film side of things. And then just to sort of fast forward to 2010, I mean, and the beginning.
Can I stop you here, actually?
Sorry, I'm on a big roll. One second.
No, I don't want the Cliff Notes version as much as I'm very curious about Bidoun. Let's stop at Bidoun for a second. It takes work to create cultural capitals, right? Things don't happen by accident. And over the last course of 20 years, small institutions, small legs start being put up, and then all of a sudden enough legs exist and you can put a platform on top of that thing, and then all of a sudden you have a really high platform that's producing a lot of this stuff. Let's talk about Bidoun as a publication, sort of what drew you to that project, and the role of sort of print publications in establishing cultures of art and creativity in places like Dubai.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, this is actually a topic that I'm really fascinated by, is how these kind of cultural communities come about and how they can really change the fabric of a city or a society. So, kind of that period of the early 2000s in Dubai, I mean, we have to remember that at this time, globally, let alone in the Arab world, people weren't really kind of thinking of Dubai as a cultural destination. I mean, we should be honest. Obviously the great historical cities of the Arab world, if you think of sort of Cairo and Beirut and, cities like that, were obviously the places and Baghdad, obviously, great places of deep-seated history and cultural significance. And for a Gulf state to kind of pop up and claim, hey, we're here, nobody was thinking in those terms at that time. But what I think was special about that moment is that, and maybe in contrast with some other Gulf cities or now Asian cities, is that it was very much a kind of ground up movement at that time. You had a kind of collective of people who'd were maybe, first, second, third generation, and also UAE nationals who'd maybe studied elsewhere, perhaps the last generation to really study en masse outside of the UAE, because the UAE universities were coming up in the late 90s and early 2000s. So this generation that sort of lived other cities come back. And I think what was interesting about that generation is that they kind of really felt a sense of kind of, Dubai-ness, that they came from this city regardless of where they came from originally, or their parents did. And so it was about trying to sort of express that and find something common within that could be kind of, I mean, I hate this word, but something sort of like authentic to the nature of being a Dubaian or an Emiratian in some kind of way. And I think that's, sorry, go on.
No, keep on going, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Bidoun was part of that, and many other kind of cultural entities came out of that moment of expression. And then afterwards, it was more of a kind of top-down movement from the government, and the two began to kind of work together.
Yeah, do you think if Bidoun was starting today, right, in 2020, as opposed to 20 years ago, does it have a similar mission? Does it have a similar scope? Does it have a similar Is that you think?
Yeah, I couldn't quite get the last bit of but I know where you're coming from. That's actually such a brilliant kind of question. I mean, I guess at that time there was a kind of playfulness and a bit of an irreverence, to Bidoun's tone, and sort of very playful with this idea of what does it actually mean to be from the Middle East. And in a way that kind of, the fact that there was so much international ignorance about the Arab world and the Middle East gave a kind of wriggle room to really be kind of playing on these kind of ideas about what it was like to be from the Middle East. I mean, obviously I was a total kind of newcomer, but my colleagues were from various different places in the Arab world and in Iran and Turkey. And so it was I think it was a very particular moment. If it begun now, I don't know. I mean, Bidoun obviously still exists. It's online and they're producing more content and stuff like that. But I think just the level of now of international awareness gives a certain kind of different kind of tune. And maybe despite everything going on during that time, and when we started in 2003, it wasn't exactly a happy moment in the region. But at that time, there was still a sense of sort of being able to turn things around. And I mean, thinking about the situation now, there's, you know, places of great hope, and you see an enormous amount of kind of faith in new talent and the next generation coming up. But there's also a knowingness that exists in the international community, and also a sense, I guess, if we think about what's happening in Palestine at the moment, you know, a sense of certain kind of, you know, going around in circles. Sorry to bring that.
No, yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious about if we shift now to the sort of the next phase of your career into thinking about Art Dubai. And Art Dubai is this, at this point, is this very large institution. What was the experience like working on that and helping sort of build out that institution compared to working on Bidoun, and compared to sort of smaller, maybe in film festivals, and compared to what you're doing now?
No, thank you. I mean, the fair was already, you know, 4 or 5 years old, so it was already kind of, it had gone through its kind of extremely bold and startup phase. If you think, you know, Art Dubai was the first major international art fair outside of Europe and America. I mean, now, again, that's kind of unthinkable, but we have to sort of rewind the clock and remember that the art world was seen as sort of London, Paris, New York, and everyone else was kind of out of the picture slightly. So things have obviously shifted massively since that time. I mean, obviously, personally, you know, I went through a great quandary. I've always been a writer, and on the not-for-profit side of things, what am I doing going to a commercial art fair? But I mean, I've always been really interested in this idea of the arts being a kind of Trojan horse. You know, through the arts, you can discuss pretty much everything in life, and there's a way of, it gives a kind of certain prism or a certain door to discuss things that, particularly maybe in the Gulf, we're not so readily able to discuss, or perhaps not discuss so much in the media and things like that. So, and it felt like a very kind of necessary conversation to have. And I think what was exciting is that the owners of the fair were very open to really the fair being a kind of big kind of container of all the different kinds of art forms and different kinds of ways that you can express through the arts. So yes, it was a commercial art fair, and it had a very, very important kind of position to have in terms of you know, enabling artists to sell work and live, and galleries to spring up. And, you know, through that time, Dubai became the commercial center for what became known as the Middle Eastern art world, which at that time, you know, previous to this, there hadn't really been an idea of a unified kind of Middle Eastern art category. You know, it would have been strange to be sitting in Beirut with its history of galleries and somehow feel that you have something comparable with cities in Morocco or cities in the Gulf. Yeah. But this kind of, the commercial side of things kind of gave a certain kind of unity, and the fair became, you know, very much a meeting point. It was the only time in the year where you could really meet everybody from across the region, and the international community began to come in to really kind of see this as their one stop in the year where they could really get to know what was happening in the Middle East. So I think what fairs do so well is bring together a great, and biennials too, but bring together a great community together, which can, you know, you can then put on discussion programs. We had the Global Art Forum and a huge amount of fun and incredible conversations with that. You know, Art Dubai projects and many of the kind of infrastructural things that you'd usually see around a city taken care of by other institutions became kind of part of the fair. So it was a total blast for 6 years.
Was the sense of like regionalism one of the core pillars of the planning, as in like we want to sort of help be the connective tissue that sort of fills in the gaps between these local art scenes that we think might have more in common with each other than they might realize? Was that part of the thinking?
Yeah, very much so. And that kind of idea of what is the region, you know, also began to expand into sort of thinking a lot about South Asia. So, you know, obviously if you live in the Gulf, you kind of have 2 points of you know, great connection, one with the Arab world and one with South Asia, which is, you know, through culture and history and the people who live here is incredibly tight. So I think it very much, and then towards the end of the time I was there, and this is something the fair has also pushed forward, was also a kind of desire to think about sort of the global South and the Gulf's connections with Africa, you know, which is also another really kind of fascinating kind of topic, which you know, has not really been tremendously explored. And obviously there's, through history, great connections, particularly with East Africa and the Gulf, and trading routes and things like that. And then, you know, in a contemporary sense, just, I mean, it sounds kind of banal, but, the number of African cities that Emirates flies to creates, Dubai as a kind of connector between various different cities in Africa and themselves, as well as kind of connecting to other parts of the world. I mean, it sounds very kind of glib, but there are, through those kind of transport connections and communication connections, are all sorts of cultural connections can be had as well. So it felt like a huge opportunity to really reimagine Dubai as a kind of center within that prism of the world, and in doing so kind of shake up the more traditional art world's idea of itself.
Your time with shifting to sort of Art Jameel as an organization, and really in many ways sort of representing that effort, right? That effort of building cultures of creativity across the region, and really thinking about both it from a sort of a creative, social, societal perspective, but also from an entrepreneurial and commerce perspective, right? Really building out the entire ecosystem. How has that gone? I mean, it's just like a silly question, but like, give me a status update. How's it going? How's that going?
Yeah, well, when I hear you describe it, it sounds insanely ambitious. I'm like, wow, what are we taking on here? But I think it's, kind of a desire. I mean, again, it's part of the same kind of thread, this kind of idea that through the arts you can tackle education. You can think about kind of how did artisans and artists and creative practitioners build their own communities and their own kind of, sustainability, maybe independent from government, and build up kind of, their own kind of scene. There's a certain kind of urgency in terms, I mean, exactly what you're doing, kind of thinking about the urgency of debate in this world. There's so much, and I guess it goes back to the Bidoun days too, of thinking, why is everybody else talking about this region rather than, this region being able to project itself in a way that's listened to, what's missing there. And, and in part that can be done kind of through the arts, because I'm kind of like a really firm believer that artists in particular can really draw out all the complexities of the questions that we have. It's not necessarily about giving answers, it's about kind of showing artworks that prompt debate. And I mean, just one example, we opened the Jameel Art Center in Dubai in November 2018, and the exhibition at that time called Crude, which is curated by Murtaza Vali, was a look at oil and the archives of oil and the economy of oil through the eyes of artists. So it was really opening up all these kind of, many cans of worms in one exhibition, but kind of really, and the debate that went on. I mean, we, around the opening, we had a lot of families come in and who were just curious, what's going on in this building. And through that exhibition, they were able to talk about their own family history, contemporary realities, the economy, society, belonging. So it's just about trying to create these, openings for people to come together and really debate the thorny issues out there. I mean, I was interested, your kind of thing about curiosity and community, I feel is incredibly kind of fitting, because at the beginning of Jameel Art Center, and it's the same with High Creative Hub, the complex that we're building in Jeddah, we really tried to think about this audience demographic of the curious. So, you have the kind of arts, usual suspects, the inner community that are going to come to things anyway. But thinking about the curious and just thinking of a Gulf context where you have incredibly literate, politically engaged people of all ages. I mean, how are the arts kind of providing for them? And we've tried to really make that's the curious and youth, sort of 18 to 25-year-olds. We've tried to make absolute pillars of everything we do, just thinking that these communities are kind of underserved in a way. Yeah. So why not have, reading groups that bring in people who have nothing to do with the arts, but they use an exhibition as a springboard to talk about, issues in society today. And I think that is a way of trying to stay vital.
It's so interesting, because I feel like it seems like the work of Art Jameel has like 4 audiences. They have the audiences who are in any one of the locations that you're talking about. They're the citizens, right? The nationals of that place who are going to be building local culture in some way, right? In some way taking ownership of that. Then there's also the other like foreign Arabs across the region or across South Asia who are looking. And then there's the global community who's looking. But then there's also the foreign laborers who are in all these different locales across the Arab world, who are also building culture, right? They are also shaping the local culture, the local artists. How can you sort of tailor your program to those four audiences?
Our Jameel team thinks about this a lot, you know, and this kind of idea that, I guess one, you know, thing we think about is just that the arts themselves kind of form those audiences, and they also, hopefully through the programs we do, people are actually thinking about what is society and what is community. I mean, maybe this is, I mean, I know we have a very international or regional audience today, but just maybe this is more of an urgent conversation in places that are very young. So thinking about the UAE, you know, a very young country, not really yet sort of thinking about itself as a kind of, you know, multi-ethnic community, but more kind of, you know, kind of different nationalities working together in parallel. So, I mean, we're really invested in kind of thinking, what is this? How do you form, how do people feel like stakeholders in a place? What gives people the feeling of being a stakeholder? And I think, you know, culture and community comes very much hand in hand into the forward in those kind of situations. I mean, it's been very interesting, obviously, the last few months. I mean, everybody's, you know, art institutions globally have turned to their digital audiences. And I think it was, we already had quite a lot planned in that field, but we were kind of forced to fast track them. And also a very sharp reminder that, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, people having to work from home and connect on Zoom like we are today, but also a kind of sharp reminder that, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, but, you know, vast numbers of our audiences aren't able to travel at all. They're, you know, it's a complete luxury to travel. So this has kind of been a really good reminder of how to connect with those audiences and how can you create an experience that's, you know, really sharp for somebody in the room, you know, with, you know, physically interacting with artworks just as they're supposed to be, plus that kind of online experience, and how do you open up avenues for those audiences too. So it's been, but the only way is to work through that with artists, I think.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the plans that you're most excited for, specifically in Jeddah? And, you know, you guys are building this new brick and mortar place. You have collaborations and engagements all over the region and the world, but I'm really fascinated about the sort of the work in Jeddah, and I'm curious why you picked Jeddah in general, and if you can walk us through what you're excited about that, what your plans are, what does 21, 22, 23 look like there?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, hugely exciting. So I mean, the Jameel family originally come from Jeddah, that's their hometown, and have for a long time wanted to build an art centre there. I mean, Art Jameel has existed since 2003, but always as a kind of, you know, flexible kind of agency model, working with lots of different partners from everywhere. And, you know, it became kind of apparent that we could do so much more if we were able to have our own centres. So the original idea was to build first in Jeddah and then look for an international base. The building and the centre in Jameel Art Centre in Dubai just came along very quickly and was built, you know, relatively fast. I mean, thanks to the great kind of welcome that was extended by the UAE to you know, an independent organisation like Art Jameel setting up there. And then meanwhile, Jeddah has been a little bit slower, but actually, you know, all for the better, because we were then able to hit this wave that's happened in the last 3 years in Saudi with this, where culture has become ever more kind of central to the idea of the identity of Saudi and everything happening there. So that's actually been, you know, a huge boon. I mean, just thinking back to the original plans that we had for High, you know, it was to have a theatre there, and we were able to, you know, make that sudden switch and say, right, let's make an art house cinema rather than a theatre. So we're able to kind of, you know, take that on and do that. I mean, aside from Jeddah being the Jameel family's hometown, you know, Jeddah is traditionally, I guess, you know, very much known as a kind of cultural city within Saudi. I mean, similar to Dubai, it's in a way, and this is very much influenced our thinking. It's a port city. It's obviously the gateway for pilgrims going to Saudi as well. So it has that kind of cosmopolitan and kind of openness to it, and this curiosity that we keep referring to. And but we're very keen to sort of think about each city and each city's needs. I mean, Dubai really was crying out for a contemporary art museum. It had the galleries, it had everything else going on, you know, incredible biennial and other institutions in Sharjah, the Louvre coming in as a, you know, encyclopedic museum in Abu Dhabi, but no kind of Kunsthalle type, you know, flexible kind of contemporary arts model. So we filled that gap. And then in Jeddah, you know, there's a, you know, tremendous cultural community there, and a very much a kind of granular, DIY spirit to everything. People are very used to getting up and doing things themselves, but people tend to be working from different spaces. A lot of people, producing exciting kind of programs in fashion and design and architecture, but kind of from their bedrooms or their parents' garage, or so we kind of thought with, hey, let's make this a multidisciplinary kind of hub where we can bring all those practitioners together and the audiences that support them. So it's a very open kind of endeavor. Art Jameel is running, and the cinema and the art center and artist studios, but the rest of the complex is given over to like-minded partners. So co-working space and architect studios, fantastic design galleries and art galleries. So we're super excited about it.
So before we switch to the sort of Q&A, I have two questions.
Okay.
One question is, do you get a sense that a 14-year-old kid growing up in Dubai now, who's 14 now, versus a 14-year-old in 2004, feels like they live in a city that promotes the arts? Feel like there are huge strides there? Do they say, I live in an art center?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, what's happened has been pretty remarkable. There are a few other kind of international examples where cities have changed quite so radically when it comes to the arts. But I mean, it's not to sort of pat ourselves on the back too much. I mean, at the same time, there's a gap in schools. Art is not taught in schools to the extent that we'd love it to be. And when it is taught in schools, and this is actually, I guess, kind of pretty much uniform across the region, it tends, there's a real dearth of publications in Arabic. Kids are learning at school about Picasso and Monet and Manet, which is not a bad thing, but are they really also learning about, I don't know, Walid Rad or Hassan Sharif, or, the kind of heroes of different countries and whose art they can see locally. So there's a mismatch there between the names that are known and the art that people see. And I mean, it'd be incredible to kind of be able to turn that around. There are still, in the region, there are some fantastic universities teaching art, and there are a few small art schools, but there's no, really kind of well-established art school. Still, I think a lot of parents, globally, but would far rather their kids became architects than artists, or maybe that's even wishful thinking, probably doctors and lawyers and the usual. So we've got a lot of work to do in kind of raising awareness, but hopefully we're getting there.
Okay, that's question number one. Question number two is related, which is, in 20 years, what does success look like, right? You guys are doing so much stuff, right? You're trying to build entrepreneurship, you're trying to build an ecosystem that supports creative entrepreneurs. You're trying to help artists. You're trying to build a culture of that promotes the sort of creative economy and promotes art. What does success look like? Like fast forward 20 years from now.
Whoa, right. Oh my gosh. I haven't thought too much about this. At the moment, 2020 is the year of survival. Can I get through tomorrow and do I
Seriously, you're like 20 hours. Give me 20 hours.
Exactly. Do I have a budget to last till next week? But I know, but I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I think one sort of measure of success is really around the number of other arts organizations coming forward.
Yeah.
I think maybe we've had a little bit of a situation also where patrons from this region have sometimes been much more excited to support institutions outside of the region. There are Middle Eastern committees at many of the major museums in Europe and America, and supported by many patrons who still, live in this region. So to see sort of homegrown patronage support homegrown enterprises and other kinds of museums, and a proliferation of the kinds of artistic or creative endeavors that are out there would be incredible. I mean, we have huge gaps in kind of publishing, arts criticism, education. So the more the better, and it would be incredible to see people come forward and really have faith in what's happening here on the ground. And I guess another measure of success would really be kind of the export of thought leadership and thinking from this part of the world. So I think that is definitely kind of happening, but it still needs, it's still some way to kind of go on that.
Cool.
Sorry, I know I've been waiting for a question. I'm trying to keep my answer.
No, that's fantastic. But this next section, I'm going to keep you honest. So we're going to do 4 quick questions. We'll start out with, what are you reading or watching right now? Yeah,
well, I mean, there's been a fantastic proliferation in Zoom talks, but sometimes at the end of the day, it's quite hard to kind of have more screen time. Present company excluded, obviously.
Yeah,
so I guess I've been doing quite a lot of listening. I don't know whether everybody on the chat and everyone here knows about Radio Al Hara. I'm sure you.
Yeah.
Which is based in Ramallah, Bethlehem, and Amman. And I've been listening to that a lot. Just being able to be home and working from home a little bit, you can kind of, crank up the dial and listen to things and, a little louder than you can in the office without having to have headphones. And I think their mix of kind of, fantastic debate followed by music. There's not a lot of talk when the music is on, so the talk is separate from the music. Little things like that are fantastic. And the eclectic kind of sense of conversation, absolutely brilliant.
One of my friends, Zaina, I think is playing for them, later today.
Brilliant. Yes. Yeah. Well, really, and the people they've been getting on is really fantastic. So highly recommend it. If you're on Spotify, Teju Cole, the novelist and writer, has brilliant kind of playlists that he's put together. Okay. Which really, I found out about that through the ICA London kind of newsletter that they send around, and that's been something I really recommend that.
Great. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I went for Jacinda Ardern because, of all the kind of leaders out there at the moment, I feel like she's actually kind of managed to somehow handle this corona thing. And, not to get too feminist, but just for a moment, it does seem that there's a kind of a difference at this time between female leaders and male leaders and just, or maybe it's more about ego. Those that can park the ego and look for practical solutions and have a sense of humanity seem to be winning through this moment. So I think she's a fascinating character. She has a huge amount of empathy. And
that's a great choice. What do people most misunderstand about your work or your line of work?
I think my line of work, maybe they think that the arts is for the elite or the arts is somehow kind of glamorous. And I think people tend to focus, at least the mainstream global media tends to focus on auction houses and the kind of mega galleries, which are really art for the 1% of the 1%. And, I really think that's a total misnomer, and we need to open up and have everyone understand that the arts is for everyone.
Fantastic. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
Well, this sounds like a bit of a plug, but, we have at the Art Center at the moment, Michael in Dubai, Michael Rakowitz, the Iraqi-American artist, has a 2-floor exhibition. And he was with us in early March. We were able to open the exhibition before we had to close, and now we're luckily reopened. But he's just one of the most inspiring artists I've ever worked with. He's done everything from set up, food trucks in America, which are staffed by US Army vets, serving food from his grandmother's recipes, his Iraqi grandmother's recipes on plates that were looted from Saddam Hussein's palaces. So if you think about, just unpick that, it's, just incredible. And so he's a real kind of artist, and he's a people's artist, and he's just the most generous person out there. So please have a look at our website, and you can actually, wherever you are, you can live stream his project he did, which can sort of unmashes the breakup of the Beatles with the breakup of the Pan-Arab project. So just as one example of the kind of things he does. So he's brilliant. And I guess the other person is a perennial kind of inspiration who's probably very familiar to everybody, is Sultan Al-Qasimi, who, we'll all know. But I think he's just done the Zoom thing brilliantly. He's always connecting people. He's always kind of just this great sort of doyen of cultural connectivity. So thank you to Sultan.
So let's open it up to everybody. We have a question from somebody named M.H. Sarkis. So would you mind unmuting yourself?
Hi, Mikey. Hi, Antonia. Thank you for that talk. Very interesting. Antonia, so what would you say, well, actually, I feel curious to know whether you or perhaps artists that you've commissioned have experienced any roadblocks on your path in the industry, especially in these conservative cities? And if so, how have you managed to navigate these obstacles?
I think, I'm trying to think of specific roadblocks. I mean, they've always been, kind of there's the very obvious roadblocks. And then I think for all of us, probably everybody on this chat, there are also hidden roadblocks as well that you can sometimes bump over and you only realize after you've gone over them that they kind of, broke the axis of your car, or, I'm trying to think of the right metaphor here. But, and I guess the trick for all of us is never to try and, work in that way where we predict those roadblocks. We need to sort of somehow kind of ride them. I think that the way of I'm trying to think of specific kind of examples. I mean, there've definitely been cases in different exhibitions I've worked on where there's been question marks over whether we should show this work or that work, and kind of, raised questions over that. I think one of them, but having said that, some of the most interesting dialogues I've ever had about art have been with security people and people from ministries of information. And actually, I guess I kind of realized that those conversations are incredibly important and kind of nourishing it. You're really challenged on why is this artwork saying this? What is it trying to say? What does it kind of mean? And how can it affect society? And to try and actually use that as a kind of positive experience to have those discussions and challenge yourself to be able to answer those questions. And eventually, in a lot of cases, it's actually resolved in something really kind of positive. So that's been, I guess one of those things of trying to see silver linings, but it can, things can actually be pushed forward. And just, I guess, context is everything. I guess that's the one, learning from that. Some things which can be discussed in one forum or in one medium are a kind of no-no in another. So it's about sort of finding those little slip routes and making sure that the context of everything is there.
Sure. So
the other roadblock is just funding, but that's the same for all of us.
Yeah. Great. Thanks so much. Lujane, you're up next. If you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you for the talk. It's great. I think you actually answered the question I was going for. It was how is Art Jameel going to be more involved in the Jeddah art scene? But maybe just another quick question is, are you planning on focusing on artists from nationally or internationally? Because I know in Dubai, for example, there's a lot of interest on international artists. So I was wondering if that is going to be the same when it's in Jeddah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lujane, and great to meet you and have a Jeddawi on the line. I mean, in Jeddah, I should point out that we do have our Jameel house in the Balad as well. So we're very focused also on...
very familiar with, as I was part of it.
Excellent. So, we're kind of very interested in this idea that the arts sit on a kind of continuum from artisanship all the way through to the most cutting edge of kind of contemporary art, and that these things are kind of connected and not seen in separate pockets. I mean, the idea is that, I guess, with Art Jameel, at least our work in kind of more recent years, is to really focus on the grassroots and kind of ground up approach in Jeddah. So supporting Saudi artists and making connections with the international scene. That's something that, within the Gulf, within the Arab world, and also kind of internationally, but never to kind of leapfrog the region in order to, reach more traditional kind of arts capitals, I guess. So it's a mixture of both, but we're planning a lot of commissions and educational opportunities. We already run a program called High Learning, which is for artists and curators doing on the ground kind of training and long form and short form courses as well. So really trying to deliver at the grassroots.
Hi, Antonia. Very excited to be able to ask you a question live.
Thank you.
I feel that the interest of the Western world with the Arab world is a two-edged sword for us Arabs. On the one hand, we are flattered and excited when our culture becomes a topic of conversation in Western academic circles and cultural circles. But on the other hand, there is that knee-jerk reaction that makes it feel Orientalist in the political pejorative sense of Edward Said, where it reduces us to natives sometimes with an exotic visual culture that to be observed and studied, but not as a valid entity that is equal to the Western world. So it also plays out on an Emirati sensitivity in specific, where, the last 20 years have been exciting, but also created an identity crisis with a lot of Emiratis, not being able to decipher which was positive cultural development and what was cultural occupation, if you want, by Western values that often erased our own. So from your extensive experience in the area and your perspective, how do you see this dichotomy playing out?
That's such a good question, and I mean, I'm not sure I'm the best to talk, because obviously this is it's a multilateral conversation that should have so many voices in it. I mean, I totally know where you come from. I mean, at the fair at Art Dubai, especially during the early years, when a lot of international people were coming to the region for the first time and opting to focus their trip on the UAE, and also international media, there was a tremendous focus on, we used to call it the three kind of bugbears. It was always women, war, and censorship, and every single question would be about that, to do with the art. Instead of thinking, what is the artist's voice? What are they trying to portray? And really and it also ran a danger of kind of funneling artists towards those topics rather than exploring things that were important to their own communities, or not to say these aren't important, but just being able to see a sort of diversity of subject matters that were really kind of expressed by thinking aloud in public with your own community, rather than having to sort of be continuously broadcasting to the world. So I think that has significantly changed, and it's through the efforts of artists themselves kind of thinking about how to, kind of really discuss their art in a local context before brokering an international conversation. But I think what will change it is also making sure that infrastructure exists all around the artists as well. So I already mentioned kind of critics. I think that's hugely important, educators, and that there's a kind of, the arts is a kind of ecosystem, and you need every single piece of the pie to be there to really kind of create a very robust and kind of sustainable scene. And we're lacking in some areas at the moment, and those areas are not necessarily given enough attention. And the other thing is, which we're trying to really push quite a lot in Saudi at the moment too, is kind of original writing in Arabic, rather than everything necessarily being a translation from one to the other, and to develop a kind of vocabulary in Arabic to talk about contemporary art, so that way the conversation can be owned and developed further. But I mean, I'm obviously one voice and not the right person necessarily to
Thank you.
Thanks, Ria. And then the last question is from Nadine.
Hey, Antonia.
Hey, hi.
Yeah, it's funny.
Nadine from Canvas.
Yeah, on Zoom, and we normally sit just across from each other. But I'll be paying the center a visit hopefully soon this week. So I found it so interesting what you were saying, because I was not here at the beginnings of the art scene. What you mentioned that started as a very kind of, ad hoc, let's say, grassroots, a flourishing of collectives, such as Bidoun, but others as well. And now we're kind of in a place where probably, which probably has amongst the most developed art infrastructures in the Middle East in terms of government support. And so we both know what that actually does in terms of supporting talent, but also maybe there seems to be less of the more self-organizing initiatives that exist elsewhere in the region with longer histories, such as Beirut and Cairo, Baghdad, and so forth. So given that you've had a foot in both the commercial and the non-commercial sectors, and you've witnessed this growth firsthand, and also the formalization, I would say, of the art industry here. My question is, in an economy where both the public and the private coexist, especially in terms of funding, how can we further incubate, or how can institutions such as Art Jameel further incubate talent from the ground up, which I know you actually answered partly in your answer to Lejane, but I'm speaking less in terms of support, but more in terms of allowing for that space for these kind of collectives to develop on their own, and then supporting them. You understand, like, we have only one artist-run collective in the whole of the UAE that is known, and that, I've documented since their inception, and that is Beit 15. And this is, partly, I think, in other countries of the Arab world where there's a lot of political strife, artists have had to rise up, and this is, thankfully a quite stable place to live, but then that's the other side of the coin. So I'm just wondering if you had some thoughts on that, over time, like what you've witnessed over the past 20 years, and how you think this can maybe merge in a different way,
No, well, thank you. And I totally understand where you're coming from. And I think these kind of informal artists collectives or groupings of designer, other art forms too, designers and architects and writers being able to sort of set up these little kind of interstitial places. If you think about, it's like having a city where you have only high rises. You don't have a kind of, an infrastructure that exists underneath. You need it, and artists need it, and the whole scene can only thrive in that kind of way if it has that kind of diversity and that kind of informality that allows these things to spring up. Partly, I guess it's to do with, once you get a kind of legislation that's there to support the arts, it's a double-edged sword because it's also there to control, there's less kind of ability for these little sort of informal spaces to kind of come up. I think a lot has to do with educational establishments. So if you think of the influence of Ashkal Alwan in Beirut, for example, every year, and hopefully this year too, there are graduates coming out of that school, and many of them, even if they're from other places, they stay in Beirut. They begin to set up things together. So an art school, even if it's an informal one, like Ashkal Alwan, can just have this absolute transformative effect on a city. And here, NYU Abu Dhabi has made a massive difference. The rise of higher education in the Gulf has gone hand in hand with the art scenes, and that is a very particular and fascinating kind of history. But it hasn't necessarily translated from an art school format into kind of developing these, in between collectives that are really the glue that holds the whole scene together. But I see it changing. And I think it's also for us to kind of think through what is a collective? Is it two people who decide to sort of do something together off their own bat? Is it a one-off event? It can be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal kind of collective. So it's recognizing those young people doing that and really supporting them.
Antonia, thank you so much for joining. This was a pleasure to have you on at afikra. We really respect and admire the work that you're doing, so it's a thrill to have you on.
Well, ditto, absolutely, and same back to you, and thank you to everybody for joining. As we said, we know we have a lot of Zooms and screen time, so it's extra appreciated during these times.
Absolutely. Good luck. Thanks, everybody. Hope you stay safe wherever you are. And Antonia, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed it.